Since I made the last video on white balance, and I'll put a link in the description box if you haven't seen that one. Since that video, I've thought a lot more about white balance, and I've also been testing it with my own images, with my own photography. And the conclusion I've come to is that if we're shooting outside in natural light, shooting nature subjects, then we're probably shooting between 5,000 and 6,000, maybe 6,500 Kelvin. You're probably not going to be shooting outside of that range too much. So what I did, just out of interest, was to go through raw files and just adjust it and to warm the temperature, because I wanted to see if my images would look better a little bit warmer. So I went through a lot of pictures and I warmed them up, and what I found was if I got to 6,000 or certainly beyond 6,000 Kelvin, they just always looked too warm. I thought there was virtually no image at all that looked okay to my eye if I warmed it at 6,000 Kelvin or higher. So that was really interesting for me. So for myself, I think if I'm going to set it on my camera, then I'm probably shooting in the range of 5,500 to 6,000 Kelvin, which is a really short range. So I'm not going to worry about it too much. At the moment I've got it set for 5,600 Kelvin, which is a bit warmer than what I was used to, and I'm already happier with the images I'm getting. They look a little bit warmer, and particularly in the shade, they definitely look better colours to me. So I'm definitely happy with the improvement. So with that said, if you want to set the colour temperature in your camera so you don't want to change it all the time, then it might actually make sense to set it about 5,500 Kelvin. Now if you set it at that, you're basically putting it slap bang in the middle on the colour temperature range, like bright white sunlight in the middle of the day. And then if you're slightly either side of that, if the light is a bit warmer or the light's a bit cooler, I don't think you're going to be a million miles away from that. So you could set it around 5,500 and leave it at that most of the time, and then if you want to make slight adjustments, you could do that afterwards in post-processing. A really good exercise, I think, and I did this myself with lots of images, is to have a look at your raw file, and I did this in Lightroom. Have a look at the raw file and see the colour balance that you picked, and then change it to auto. So change the white balance to auto and see the difference. And the reason this is so good is because it's a really good way of learning to see how the camera would actually adjust the white balance. So what you're seeing by doing this is you're finding out what the camera would actually have done had you left the white balance on auto. So it gives you more of an idea how the camera's working, how it's seeing the light, and how it's going to change that colour balance. And sometimes you'll find it might be pretty similar, sometimes it's a little bit different, and sometimes it can be massively different. So what about trying to get an accurate white balance, trying to match the white balance in the camera to the light that's hitting your subject? Do you always want to match it? Is that what you should be doing? Well, that's kind of what this video is about, really. You don't always want to get the white balance to be neutral. It simply doesn't make sense, not in my opinion anyway. So if you take the 5,500 Kelvin, because this is a good example, this works really well. If you shoot on that colour temperature, then naturally if you have warmer light, so let's say early in the morning with some really nice warm sunlight coming across, because you're on 5,500, that is naturally going to look warmer in your picture. Now, the other end of the scale, if it was more kind of twilight, again, the colour temperature is still on 5,500. Anything that's cooler in the shade is going to look cooler, bluer in your picture. So if you just leave the colour temperature there in the middle, then either side, you're going to be keeping that effect. You're going to be preserving that colour balance in your images. In this example of a gorgeous red grouse up in the Yorkshire Dales, this was very early morning sunshine, probably within the first hour of sunshine, and it's casting really lovely warm lighting onto this bird. And if I was to correct it here to try and match it, to make it neutral, it would just take away from that. We wouldn't have that really nice effect from that lighting. With this landscape image, which is actually moon, this is moonlight here, taken on a summer evening. If we were, again, to try and correct this, to give what we call a correct white balance, then it would take away that blue cast. If we leave it on 5,500, it's naturally going to look bluer, and we're going to keep that really nice cool feel to the image. Which brings me to the main point, and that is that maybe you just want to preserve the mood that was there at the time you were photographing, or maybe you want to try and recreate that mood afterwards in post-processing. The white balance that you choose is going to have a real bearing on how you perceive the image and how the viewer perceives the image in terms of mood. So if you were to choose a white balance, a warmer white balance, that is going to give feelings, it's going to make it feel physically warmer, but it's also going to give maybe feelings of comfort, maybe make it more inviting, maybe even friendlier. If you're to use a cooler, bluer colour temperature, and that's going to be very, very different. It's maybe going to make it look more stark and certainly physically colder, lonely maybe, but it can also make it feel quite serene at the same time. So the colour temperature you choose will have a real effect on the mood of your image. So here we've got an image of a stag, and there's already atmosphere there with a fantastically thick mist. But what I did was actually to change the colour balance. I've done this afterwards in post-processing. So the image already had atmosphere, but you can tweak that slightly, again, to just change the mood. So for one image, I have changed it. I've actually used the shade white balance. In the raw file, I've changed it to shade, and you can see it's made it much warmer. And then the second image, I've actually put it to tungsten, so I've made it much bluer and cooler by choosing the tungsten setting, the tungsten white balance. So you can see there the same image, but really just gives totally different feel depending on how you adjust the white balance. Now, you might not need to change the white balance too much under natural daylight conditions, but if you find yourself shooting under artificial lighting, then it's going to make a massive difference, and you really need to pay attention to the white balance setting on your camera. Now, I've had the good fortune of photographing some amazing subjects in some really unusual lighting. So a few years back, when I was photographing long-eared owls in Serbia, it really was quite a study of the light, and certainly a study of the white balance now I look back on it. These birds were roosting, and they were roosting in a very urban location, and as the light started to fade, the artificial lights came on. So these were kind of your ordinary street lights or floodlights, quite orangey yellow. I think some might have been more yellow, which I think might be sodium, but don't quote me on that. Someone will know about sodium lighting out there. But basically, when the natural light had gone and the artificial light started to take over, that's when the white balance became much more important. I did play around with this, and I've played around with it more since. I noticed from looking at the raw files of some of these images of the owls, that what seemed to happen was when we got into sort of twilight, when we got into that twilight situation, the camera, if I put it on auto to see what the camera would have done, the camera was actually choosing around 7,000 Kelvin. So it's basically saying this is very cool and shaded, which is correct, and that's the colour temperature it was picking. And maybe there was just a little bit of artificial light at that point as well, but it wasn't having too much effect. Now, as the natural light started to fade and the artificial lights took over and they became the main light source, what happened then is, if I put it on auto, I can see that the camera is selecting usually a tungsten, usually around a tungsten setting most of the time. So it's basically saying that the main lighting there is as a quality of tungsten lighting, which it probably was. Now, I found, I'm getting bitten by midges here. I found that personally the tungsten just seemed a little bit too blue for me. So again, I've just gone through the raw, on the raw file, changed the white balance and see which I prefer, see what the camera would have done. And I found that when I put it on fluorescent, it just seemed to look much nicer. So on daylight was probably not quite right. Tungsten was too blue, and fluorescent for me a lot of the time on these images just seemed to look really nice, seemed to give a nice balance. So in these situations, especially where you've got a combination, as it did, a combination of natural twilight and warm artificial light, you get a really interesting contrast, and it's what made the images for me, a real contrast of blue and yellow in there. But it also makes it difficult to get the correct white balance. So again, you can play around with this afterwards. If you're not sure at the time, you're really not sure, you're getting confused, and you just want to concentrate on taking the pictures, then don't worry about it. Just change it afterwards and change it to your eye and your personal taste. Ugh. The big question, of course, was should you change the white balance in the camera or afterwards? Why not just do it afterwards in post-processing? Lots of people ask that question. I think it's really just down to personal choice. I think what I would say is try and shoot as a raw file so you can do it after. I did have someone say you could change it as a JPEG in one of the camera systems, but I think the message really is you might be able to make some adjustments of white balance in JPEG, but it's safer to do it in RAW because I think it will give you more manoeuvre to change that colour temperature. So my own personal take on this is, I think if you can select the white balance in the camera at the time you're taking the photograph, then I just think you become more in tune with everything you're doing. So you do everything else in the camera, or mostly, shutter speed, aperture, your composition. So if you can, why not try and do the white balance as well? It's all part of the process of creating something that you want to create for yourself. And also by doing that, I just think it might make you think about the image differently. So if you think about changing the mood, then maybe you start to see a different composition, maybe you compose it differently, maybe you think about underexposing or deliberately overexposing, for example. Maybe just makes you think differently, the fact that you try to change the mood with the white balance. So obviously, why not do that? Why not do it in camera? Well, if you're photographing wildlife, then you simply might not have time, and it's just better to just bag the image and make that adjustment afterwards in post-processing. But I think, certainly personally for me, if I have the time, then I would rather try and get the white balance in camera, because I like to do everything in camera as much as I possibly can. And for me now, thinking about it more since making this last video, that includes the mood as well. So do you prefer to change the white balance in the camera or afterwards in post-processing? Do let me know in the comments box, and if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like and subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and I'll see you in the next one.